Hey, and welcome back to Heimler's History. Now, in these last few videos, we've been working our way through Unit 6 of AP World History. We've been talking about the imperialistic expansion that was going on during this time all across the globe from 1750 to 1900. And in this video, we're going to talk about the economics of imperialism because arguably economics is the biggest driving force of imperial expansion. Because hey, if the Skrilla don't materialize, we got no reason to imperialize. Alright, let's get to it. Okay, so as certain nations grew in their industrial capacity, they found that they were in great need of two things. They needed more raw materials for their factories and more food to feed the urban populations that were growing off the charts. So let's look at both of these and see the kind of effects this new demand had across the world. Alright, let's begin with agriculture. So if you've been watching these videos, you know that Africa was a key target of European imperial expansion. Before the Europeans showed up, most Africans engaged in subsistence farming, which is to say they only grew enough for them to live on. But once their light-skinned friends from the north came down and imposed their power, they booted subsistence farming in favor of cash crop farming. Now, a cash crop is a crop that's grown not for a family to live on, but for sale in a distant market. And so now in Africa, whole plantations were devoted to cash crops like coffee or rubber or sugar. And again, the purpose of these crops was to export them to the colonial powers who demanded them. Also, meat. One of the consequences of industrialization was a growing middle class. And once these folks got a little more money in their accounts, they found that their mouth holes were positively drooling for beef. And so here's where you find colonial holdings in Argentina and Uruguay raising buttloads of cows for export to Europe. Now you might think that meat shipped all the way across the Atlantic Ocean might, upon arrival, be, what's the scientific word? Stanky. But ships equipped with new refrigeration technology ensured that the meat would arrive unspoiled. Also, poop, or more specifically, guano. With all this increase in agriculture around the world, demand for fertilizer increased right along with it, and guano, which is a fancy word for bat and seabird poop, had been piling up in Peru and Chile for centuries. And so guano became a huge part of Peru and Chile's export economy. Sometimes I wonder, how did that first conversation go? Hey, how are y'all? Now listen, we got lots of mouths to feed over in Europe, so we're gonna need your poop. You're gonna need our what? I don't believe I stuttered. We're gonna need your poop. Okay, that's what's going on around the world with respect to agriculture. Now let's turn our attention to raw materials. Now, because industrial factories needed raw materials to keep churning out manufactured goods for sale, they turned to the colonies to provide said raw materials. We need to talk about a few of these raw materials in particular. First, cotton. So during the Industrial Revolution, about 80% of cotton for British textiles was imported from America. And then America was rude enough to get themselves embroiled in a civil war, and the cotton exports dropped dramatically. And so what the British did not do in such a case is say this: let's just shut down the factories for a while. Haven't we made enough money? No. They were like, let's go to Egypt. And so by the late 1800s, 90+% of all Egypt's exports were cotton. Now, to be fair, Britain also turned to India for cotton as well, but there's only so many examples you can hold in your brain folds. Okay, second raw material, rubber. As the Industrial Revolution ground on, rubber became a crucial material. They used rubber for tires and the soles of shoes and hoses and gaskets for their machines. Now, in case you don't know, rubber actually comes from trees, rubber trees to be specific, and these trees grew in great abundance in the Amazon rainforest in South America. And so colonial powers forced the natives to work at rubber extraction. And I know that sounds bad, but don't worry, most of the rubber trees and vines were destroyed in this endeavor. The third raw material we're going to consider is palm oil. This came from West Africa, and it was an important food crop for them, stretching back time immemorial. But industrial powers took a great interest in palm oil because, as it turns out, it was a great lubricant for their factory machines. Therefore, they turned palm oil into a cash crop and used enslaved laborers to produce it. Fourth raw material, diamonds. Starting in 1871, there was a diamond rush in South Africa. Cecil Rhodes was an Englishman who formed the De Beers Mining Company, and because of his ambition in this area, South Africa was exporting 90% of the world's diamonds by 1890. Rhodes thus became very powerful and ended up getting himself elected to the South African Parliament. And by 1890, Rhodes became the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. And it was his racist policies in South Africa that laid the foundation for apartheid, which is to say racial segregation, but we'll get to that in another video. Okay, now that we've seen how agriculture and raw materials fit into the larger economy during this period, let me show you two consequences of all this. Consequence number one, an increasingly interconnected global economy. So as I said before, industrial nations needed raw materials to feed their machines, and they imported those raw materials from their colonies. And once those raw materials were turned into manufactured goods, they sold them right back to their colonies. Also, this interconnectedness had to do with food. Urban populations were growing, and that means there wasn't enough domestically grown food to stuff everyone's mouth hole. So in order to meet that demand, demand, these countries began to import foodstuffs from their colonies. And all that was made possible by new technologies like refrigeration. Okay, that's the first consequence, and that's basically just a rehash of everything I've said up to this point. But the second consequence is the narrowing and weakening of the colonial economy. This large-scale shift to cash crop farming meant that the colonial people often grew these cash crops at the expense of other agricultural necessities. Additionally, when a colonial economy is dependent on a single agricultural export or a handful of those, then if something goes wrong with that crop, then they are in big trouble financially. For example, crops like cotton severely deplete the nutrients in the soil. And so there was only so long that they could go on planting this single crop, and if that crop failed, their economy failed right along with it. Alright, that's what you need to know about Unit 6, Topic 4 of AP World History. If you're interested in gaining superhuman powers while you're studying for AP World History, then check out my review packet right here. If you like this video and want to keep watching, then subscribe and come along. If you have any questions, leave them down below in the comments and I will answer them forthwithly. Heimler out.